You're listening to the Veterinary Innovation Podcast.
You're listening to the Veterinary Innovation Podcast. My name is Shawn Wilkie, and along with my awesome co-host, we interview the innovators in this space every week. Ivan, please go ahead and introduce today's guest.
Hey, I'm Ivan Zach, and I'm very excited to introduce you guys to a friend of mine and a veterinarian and a business guy. His name is Alan Robinson. He is a managing director of VetDynamics. He has a diploma of management studies from Sweden College. He has a bachelor of veterinary science, business management, and marketing from University of Queensland. Alan Robinson started and grew a successful mixed animal practice in rural Westshire for 15 years before diversifying into business management. He's now the proud owner and the director of the UK-based veterinary business consultancy and education company VetDynamics. He is a father, husband, collector of friends, and trusted business advisor to more than 1,000 practices worldwide. His mission during the last 2 years has been to reignite purpose, passion, people, and performance in independent veterinary practices globally. And in doing this, he has helped independent practice owners improve performance and achieve the quality of life they deserve. A fun fact, his hobbies include reading, motorbiking, and hopefully again soon, world travel. Alan, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for finding the time.
Ivan, thanks very much. Hi, how are you? And Shawn, good to see you both.
So, we've talked so much. Another interesting fact that I recently found out, I took that training, Shawn, I told you about the flow state, and at Flow Research Collective, it's called Zero to Dangers. It was a very interesting journey. And then one of the coaches that I have there, that she said that, oh, you guys are, because I presented as my massive transformative goal, what they call there is helping veterinarians to overcome burnout. And she said, well, I know a vet who's doing that as well. And I said, that's Alan Robinson. And I literally, I didn't even guess twice. It was so interesting, but then I didn't realize how deep you're in it. So aside from the amazing business, strategy that you provide for independent vets, you've been working on this sort of empathy angle and the burnout in our domain. Can you tell us a little bit more? What was this like, and where are you going with this?
Sure. It's interesting journey. I mean, I'm a business consultant, so my day job is getting there, talking to vets around business. And as we all know, vets are great at fixing dogs, cats, and horses, but they're pretty shoddy at actually running businesses, looking after people, looking after themselves. And so most of what we do, teach them finance and marketing and people management, which is the standard stuff, which is what they need. But of course, what we do know is people don't learn, people don't take on new ideas, people don't adapt unless they're in a good state to do so. And that's a physiological state of flow, and they need trust with the team to make that work on a real life level. So these concepts of flow and trust have intrigued me forever around how do we get that to happen. But as we learned through things like the Flow Collective and other sort of studies, neuroscience, psychology, until you can raise people to a level of consciousness or maturity or whatever you want to call it, none of these things land really well. The point is, I've got a job for life teaching business to vets who are burnt out and distressed because they will never pick up the basics.
That's awesome. Alan, so, the topic for today is really interesting. This whole idea of empathy and a problem around empathy. Can you give us a bit of backdrop as to how you arrived to this kind of hypothesis and kind of where you're going next?
I'll come clean. It's not my hypothesis. It's actually come off a Canadian study, as I believe. It was called Veterinary Mental Health and Client Satisfaction. I can even give you some reference, Perrott, Best, Coe, Kasha, and someone else that I can't read, who did this study. And it was really intriguing. And I picked it up. It's a really in-depth piece of work. It's very complicated using fairly hefty psychological models. But they sort of came up with this hypothesis that basically client satisfaction would be positively associated with measures of veterinary mental health. High client satisfaction, high veterinary resilience is the natural assumption people make. Happy vets make happy clients, and therefore the business does better, etc. And of course, the contra of that is that negative measures of veterinary mental health means low client satisfaction. Unhappy vets, unhappy clients. That was the assumption. And we actually see that as a positive correlation in the human mental health world. It's been reported. happy doctors have happy clients. They did this study and they looked at a whole range of veterinary mental health issues, burnout, depersonalization, what else, anxiety scores, depression, etc. Grafted them, and they all did an interesting thing. And they measured them against client satisfaction, fairly standard client satisfaction measures. And it wasn't a linear result, it was a U-shaped curve for most of them. So at the highest client satisfaction was at the both ends of the veterinary burnout spectrum, okay, where the normal people exist in the middle. Client satisfaction dropped, okay, is what we got. So it sort of reinforced a normality model. But the surprising thing was that the unexpected result was the higher client satisfaction scores were suggestive of poor mental health, okay? So the people with the happiest clients had the most burnt out vets. So that raised the question, why is that so? And it was across all these measures. It was quite spectacular in the way it turned out. And so where do we go with that? So vets in the study, high levels of empathy. So they broke it down into compassion and empathy to see if there was any factors in that as well. So empathy is having that feeling of understanding someone else's position, and it's a primary veterinary skill that we've all been told we have. And then compassion is the other piece of almost stepping into that space and taking on the problems of the client, problems of the pet for that matter. And so what they got was vets, high levels of empathy had higher levels of client satisfaction. Brilliant. Okay, that works. But unfortunately, they had higher risk of poor mental health as well. So this is leading back to something you've looked at, Ivan, is this compassion fatigue thing. The more we step into it, the more we burn out. Okay. But then they reverse that and say, what's causing here? What's the causal relationship? So what they're thinking is, does high levels of client satisfaction actually correlate with high scores in anxiety, mental exhaustion, and depersonalization? They were the top three mental activities going on. Anxiety, stressed about it. Emotional exhaustion or compassion fatigue, perhaps in that I just can't do this anymore. And depersonalization, I'm out of here. I've stepped out of the arena with this stuff. So that poses a couple of interesting approaches to the client-vet relationship that we can work on. It goes into a lot of things around gender. Females were more prone than males in certain aspects of this. The other study I associated with this, there's some work done by Elizabeth Armitage Chan, who works at the Royal Veterinary College in London. And they do a lot of student studies of studying some of these things. And when they did a review of vets' interaction with clients, they did a study and they asked, what's the most stressful thing being a vet? And they did this with nurses as well, technicians. They came up with the biggest stressor was clients, okay? And there's this positioning of clients as the enemy, okay? That's our stressor when we go to work. Bloody clients make this job really hard, okay?
I believe it.
So we're getting a confused picture. Compassion, empathy, client satisfaction dropping, and then we now see that actually vets physically see that, or a framing clients in that negative context, etc. So we haven't got a very good role model here to work on. Back to my original assertion, if we are then put in a room with the enemy, what's your immediate physiological state? There's a fight-flight mechanism kicking in, number one. Okay. Now, expecting people to be innovative, creative, compassionate, forward-thinking, they're never going to be in that state. We've got three states we can be in. Up there, socially contacted, working with people, innovative in activity, or we drop into fight-flight, or we drop into depersonalization, stepping away. And that's our three choices. And what I'm seeing constantly, and this is my massively transformative purpose, as Ivan talked about, is how do we shift this mass of people up from depersonalization, at least into some activity of fight-flight, because at least you're showing you're alive at that point. But actually, how do we get into then social connection, which is where compassion, where empathy lives? And that's the bit that's missing from the profession most of the time. Now, we've constructed on that consultation models that work with that.
So, Alan, what does that look like in practical implication? How do we get there?
Okay, good question, Shawn. And that's the bit. We can have all this theory, and we kind of know this intuitively, that something's not working in that consulting space. So The model for us is there's sort of 4 elements to a consultation that need to happen to be successful, to be profitable, to get client results, to get patient results. There's the clinical input. There's the duty of the vet to make a clinical diagnosis, treatment plan, etc. And that's solely the realm of the vet. Despite clients turning up with Dr. Google and everything else, the vets make that decision. That clinical decision creates a cost implication to the client. Okay, so the client's got to pay for something, make it happen. Now that's the problem of the client, to pay for that, to find the money, to come up with that, etc. And we do things to help that, etc. So they're the 2 realms of responsibility. I've done my job as a vet. You've got this problem that's been created for you, or you've got this expectation for you to pay for it. Beyond that, there's 2 sort of pieces that join that. There's the compliance piece. I'll do my bit, you do your bit, and between us, we'll serve this animal and get it better. So there's a compliance conversation to be had. There's also a compassion conversation to be had. It says, okay, I understand you're now distressed, you're worried about that, I'm concerned for the client. And vets need to show the compassion and empathy for that. And that's as far as it goes most of the time, because there also is a part of the equation that the client needs to show compassion for the vet as well, okay? And not pass that anxiety, stress, and worry onto the vet. Equally, the vet has a responsibility not to go in and take that. So what we happen is 2 models happen. The vet either steps into that realm and they do a couple of things. They take on the clinical role, mostly. They step in and take the cost issue off the client. Oh, don't worry about it. I'll discount it. I'll make it easier for you. I won't mention it. I won't
all the time.
The classic business problem that we deal with. Equally, They step into the compliance space and says, I'll do this, I'll do that, I'll make sure all these things happen, and we actually deny the client the responsibility of that. Then we step into the compassion space and take all that stress and anxiety as well, and we step in that. And that's when you get the compassion fatigue, the secondary traumatic stress and burnout. That's the key to that, the stepping into that realm, rather than keeping the barriers there. The second model that I see is the vet steps out of the equation. They say, well, don't want anything to do with it, and they step away. They walk away from the clinical responsibility almost, but they step away from the cost. That's your problem, madam. I can't do it. That's the gold standard. That's what we're going to do here. They step well away from the compliance. You know, I've given you the treatment. I told you what to do. Crack on and do it. I don't even want to see you again in some ways, and I'm being very blunt about this. And then they step away from the compassion, and of course, they can justify. So I'm protecting myself here. I can't step into it. So we lose any value created in the consultation from the client's perspective, from the patient's perspective, from the business perspective.
So, Alan, there's got to be a missing group of skills or a couple of skills that are missing here, because there's people that do this successfully. You know, there's consolidators, there's businesses that are massively successful with happy clients that must have skills that some of the veterinarians don't have. So what are those skills?
Now, that's the golden question. So how do we find balance in vets? How do we get them to manage that process every 15, 20 minutes if they have to be doing that sort of work? This is where the burnout comes from. And most vets do it. I'm being a bit ingenuous by saying, you know, vets are terrible at this. But we all spend some time stepping into consultations, and we all spend time stepping out of it. What we know from the flow science, those that do manage that very well, they take a couple of things. The flow cycle says, one, we struggle, we work in that environment for a few hours for whatever we have to do. And it's hard, and we need flexibility in that. The ones I'm talking about that step right in or step right out lack some of that flexibility. The flexibility comes from decompression, stepping out of that arena for enough time to get your balance back, or decompress from the stress. That puts you on the edge of creative thought, flow, and different things. It raises your physiological state from fight, flight back to social connection, which is the higher autonomic parasympathetic state we need to be in for flow. From that, we step out of that back into a gradation back into the challenge of working it through. So it's that self-regulation and co-regulation with others that actually drives that skill, which is communication skills, meetings, all the systems and processes we teach, but it puts them in a context of when and where they're actually effective. But we have 2 choices from a business perspective. Either We can work on vets and make them more flexible. We can teach them better skills. We can teach them some of the neuroscience. We can teach them some of the ability to be more flexible. So do mindfulness, do meditation, put yoga mats in the practice, and all sorts of things we can do around. Kind of works, but kind of doesn't work some of the time because there's a fundamental piece missing. Or the other choice we can have is actually select better clients. I know it sounds a bit bizarre, but we could actually say, why don't we limit the client numbers, number one? Because one of the biggest challenges is just veterinary busyness. Having to churn through 20 or 30 consults in a day is just mind-bendingly burnout inducing. Okay, so we might say, let's number one, reduce client numbers, limit the client to active clients per vet to something like 600 or 700 in an annualized basis. Okay, is a business model that works far better, and we've got figures that prove that. We've actually done graphs of vet production going up when client numbers go down, and then it returns normal. So we can measure that and see the response. The other thing is then restrict client quality by actually putting filters on the clients you take into your practice. As a business owner, I have a responsibility to my team to protect them from clients, from certain clients. Okay, so think some of the things we're doing over here at the moment. We're saying, you're familiar with wellness plans. You pay your direct debit.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
We're saying to some clients, or some practices are saying, to be a member of this practice, you need to enroll in our pet health club. To be a member of our client, we expect you to be insured, at least. Okay. And now that's not putting a financial imposition on people. That's putting a attitude to pet owning imposition on people. If you're not willing to actually do your preventative healthcare, if you're not willing to put aside funds to actually pay for the cost of your treatment, we'd rather not have you as a client. The typical veterinary approach is footfall, footfall, footfall. Just get people through the door. And the higher the number, the better off. There's a myth that says busyness is an indicator of success and well-being. It's not. Busyness is just an indicator of stress and burnout. And we have a term that we use called the busy trap. So typically I'd say to a vet owner, a practice owner, how are you doing? And they say, oh, yeah, we're really busy. And I'd have to say, well, that's not what I ask you, because that's not the answer. Busyness is what's killing you, my friend. Busyness is not the answer to this one. So it's two-pronged. How can we manage the client base? And I'm not saying we exclude people fundamentally, but we do say, if you want to work with us, we expect a standard of care that you bring. And equally, then you've got to educate the vets who manage that, their own self-regulation in this, which vets are notoriously bad at.
So have you seen the clinic that successfully, I mean, I'm totally fascinated with this, and I agree with every word you're saying. Now, practically, you've worked with many, many practices. Did you work with someone who took a leap and basically said, that's it, I'm going to turn everybody who, is not a fit, like there's many clients I didn't want to see when I was a vet, but you still struggle, you go in. And, the one just comment before that question is that you mentioned that, to get into this flow, you kind of get into struggle and then you get through this sort of release, and that's where you jump into flow. And we all have these days in the hospital where you just love it. Like you're just going with the flow. But what I've learned through the flow training is that you can't do it in a 20-hour shift. You need to rest, you need to compensate, you need to sleep, you need to hydrate. There's very basic physiologic and mindfulness thing that you need to do to be fit, to be in flow, at least on a regular basis. And that's the last thing that vets do. They're just not taking care of themselves. But have you seen anybody who took that sort of approach and advice and said, okay, I'm going to select the clients that actually will fit the standard of care? And if you did, have you seen the correlation with their revenue to that approach?
Yeah, a couple of points on that. I'm going to go back to the vet learning side just quickly. Fundamentals. Where in the university training or in your life were you ever told that you absolutely need, this is for basic functioning, 8 hours sleep, hydration, nutrition, don't eat crap. You actually have to exercise. You actually have to connect with
they condition us to die in the teaching hospital while you're in vet school. Like that's, I worked in the teaching hospital at night, and then I studied during the day, and I slept 4 hours at home. And that was like, and you feel like a hero. Yep.
And the human model's even worse. That's the expectation of it as interns. If you're not working 60, 70 hours a week, you're not trying hard enough. It's just the wrong model. So that's one thing, that basic understanding of how humans function. They need certain fuels and capabilities to do that. get that across to your kids right now, because that's what's going to keep them going through life. Back to your other question, from a practical point of view, yes, we have done that. So a couple of things. Most wellness plans are about vaccines, worming, flea control, and a bit of discounts, etc. We've now introduced wellness plans where all consultations are included in the plan. We're reducing one of the barriers to client engagement, the bit about cost and paying for stuff. Yes, they're still going to pay for their drugs, they've got to pay for higher level diagnostics, etc. But they're encouraging clients in with the message. Your consultation fees are covered. So we've got this wellness plan. We want you to vaccinate, want you to worm, flea control, neuter, behavior, all the hassle that goes with that. Equally, there's no barrier to coming in, seeing. If you're worried, come in, make an appointment, come in. And you might say that increases busyness. But at the same time, we said, but you can't be a client unless you join that scheme. We don't just want clients who can wander in. And this has been particularly pertinent through COVID, because as practices have shut down their capabilities through COVID, lack of staff or lack of capability, we've had a lot of clients going to the next practice, knocking on the door and saying, will you see my pet? And of course they say, yeah, come in. So they've actually induced just an over busyness of people who weren't their clients and were never going to be their clients. So push back on those. Push back on the phones, push back on the load of client interaction. But the clients you do let through, you look after them so much better. So the results of that have been a reduction in new client numbers, but a massive increase in the quality of those client numbers. And therefore, the spend per client has gone up as well. Plus, the other thing that's been really interesting with that, as a subscription-based model, they've had a constant income coming into the business through the ups and downs of COVID as well. And we think that will hold throughout as things go on. So we've got practices now with 60 to 70% of their clients as signed up subscription-based members.
Whoa, that's wow.
It's incredible.
So there's a change in paradigm there. But of course, what they've also got is a shift of client quality. And therefore, we've got a shift in staff response. Now, they love their clients. Clients are lovely. Clients are great coming in. It's good. We can actually now do veterinary work, which is all vets and nurses actually want to do at the end of the day. So it's got some subtleties to it, but the answer to the question, yeah, we have seen it working, and have seen it working very well.
Alan, it's really fascinating. And, I couldn't help but think of the example, and maybe people are going to chastise me for this, but thinking of veterinarians like electric cars. If you don't charge the batteries, like eventually it's just not going to move. Like it's just going to stay in your driveway. And it seems like the research that you've pointed us towards and a lot of what you've said is that people need to do maintenance on themselves. They need to have realistic expectations. And if any of those things are out of whack, this is really how you go down that road of compassion fatigue and burnout. Even just the time to recharge, right? Like, if you've got no gas in the battery, you're probably far better off to recharge, whatever that looks like for the veterinarian, than you are to try to sit there and hope the car moves.
Yeah, exactly right. And it's been difficult through COVID to get those down ramps to recharge. The wheels have got to turn and charge the alternator. But it's encouraged people to take those micro moments of recovery all the way through. But the other thing is, yes, we can teach vets to recharge, but if the culture in the practice says, no, keep working, we're all sort of gladiators here, we're going to just battle on through. A bit like Ivan was saying that he learned at college, that's the way you work. If that's the culture, you've got a burnout culture built in. So it's a top-down and bottom-up approach.
So it seems like there's a problem with the education system for veterinarians, that there's information or skills that are lacking. And we've talked about that tons of times on this show, whether it's the business acclimate or whatever. But it sounds like there's like a mental health element that people need to know before they get into this practice so that they don't find themselves being a statistic.
I think the given for me, and others might not agree, but the veterinary business model is fundamentally broken. It just doesn't work. Because we've been talking about mental health. Ivan talks about just the zeitgeist of the discussion in the veterinary world is mental health. And it's broader than that. It's in other professions as well. So if we just keep doing what we've always done and the problem's getting worse, don't you kind of think that we're doing the wrong thing? Is kind of the basic assumption you make with that. So let's not do that. Let's do something different. So how do we change that? Changing an ongoing practice with a culture, with the leadership, that kind of works. It kind of pays the bills. It kind of fulfills the needs. No one's going to change that until people move on or die in the process. And that where we have to make changes is in the veterinary business education model, I think is right. So back at university level, maybe even selection for university is part of that. But again, the university system is to design vets to go into the current working system. And if the working system wrong, the education system is going to be wrong. So we've got a big challenge to turn that battleship around from that perspective. But I think if we can get in there and take out some of the friction of learning, understand neuroscience, understand the physiology of people, educate people on how to look after themselves, that will shift at a grassroots level. And if then they start to go out in the profession, say, actually, this is your business, but that's not what I learned. Let's change the business because that's what I want to work at. And the beauty is this recruitment crisis that you guys have over there and we've got here, these people now have the say in where and how they work. And they might start to dictate a better world for themselves without being classed as snowflakes and every other thing that comes their way. It's really about saying, okay, look, we do need decompression time. We do want to work in a realm of flow. We do need to take time out after that to get better, but we will struggle hard when the time comes. And if we understand how that works, we'll all do it easily. It's just part of what we are as human beings.
It's absolutely fascinating, Alan, and we've chewed through all of the time that we have. So we like to wrap up in the same way. And don't worry, listeners, all of what Alan's talked about, the study that was done in Canada, we'll link in the show notes so you can explore this a bit more. But Alan, we got two questions that we always like to wrap up with. And the first one is something, whether it's a book, a TED Talk, something that's inspired you to kind of have this zest for life and this passion to solve these deep problems in the veterinary industry. Any recommendations?
Yeah, most difficult question of my life. I read about 8 books a day, so this is a really tough one. But I'm a typical vet. I love to get in and fix stuff. So anything that helps me with a fix. So the latest thing I've read was a book by an old friend of mine. He was a consultant in my early days, a guy called John Niland. He's Irish, but he lives in Belgium. He's written a book called The Self-Worth Safari. And it actually dives into one of the core elements of vet capability. And the 3 things are self-worth, belonging, and psychological safety, which I know you've featured on some of your talks. But he dives deep into the self-worth, and it's really interesting read as distinct from self-worth from self-esteem, which is what we're told at university.
Amazing. And the last question that we usually ask is there a guest that you would suggest us having on the show?
Well, I'm going to dive deep into nepotism here, but my wife is in the business. She's part of VetDynamics, but she does a lot of we develop independent practices to do really well from a personal level, interpersonal level, and business level. Okay. And then, of course, with the current corporatization, a lot of those are seeing an opportunity to raise their pensions, sell out, move on. So we're also doing that transition from independent into corporate as well in the sales process. So she's got a huge understanding of that process. And corporates aren't quite an innovation, but I think some of the things coming out of corporatization from independence and then 3rd level models about how people are going to take this forward with a new enlightened vet base, I can see that model shifting as well. So I think she'd be really interesting to talk to.
Thank you so much for listening to the Veterinary Innovation Podcast. If you want to hear about our new episodes, please follow us on any social media channel. Also, you can check out our website at veterinaryinnovationpodcast.com. See you next week.